everyone, can you hear me? Can everybody hear me? Just do a quick check. Just make sure. Yeah, I hope so. Okay, cool. Welcome to the very last talk for today. It was a hell of a gauntlet to get through. So congratulations, guys, we did it. So we can let our hair down a little bit with a little bit of RGB. Adelio did want some RGB, so here you go, Adelio. That's get that in there, mate. And also, we're just going to do some demonstration of some cool technology today. So I just want to quickly do a quick shout out for everyone joining. Huge shout out to Thomas and Adelio and Corey. Honestly, Corey is the unsung hero here. The hashtag free Corey should be trending sometime soon, I reckon, because he definitely is our unsung hero. With regards to this talk, I just would like to people have their questions at the end of the talk, just so that we can quickly go through. There's going to be a lot of content. It is a bit of a deep dive, but at the same time, though, yeah, we can just, if we can keep them to the end, that'd be great. So in this, we're going to go through all the facets on how to build an IT self-service portal powered by Function App. A quick little bit about me. I work as a senior consultant at Insync Technology. No, we're not a boy band. And I specialize in WinOps automation and PowerShell. So that's what my SME is. I'm known as that guy. I like to push the boundaries of PowerShell to the limits to see what's possible. So a great example is many years ago, I created a PowerShell aimbot for Battlefield 4 because why not? I've created a remote HTTP PowerShell bot. And I've also, as another example, I've just recently completed a stock market forum web scraper sentiment analysis function app. So it's, I also stream quite regularly. I'm the co-founder of the Brisbane PowerShell user group, and I'm an author and contributor and editor of the PowerShell conference book Volume 2 and Volume 3. I enjoy helping people. G'day Reddit. And finally, I enjoy running and playing paintball. So like I said, again, we can try and keep those questions towards the end. If I run out of time, I'll just go through them and I'll answer them in the chat. So I've got some handy dandy resources. The slides are going to be included on my GitHub, so you can just go to my GitHub down here. I'm going to turn on the pen because I love pen. You can go to the presentation here and you can get the slides, you can get the demos, you can get the code, everything's going to be there. So let's keep going. It's animations. So first thing, what this isn't. The first thing is this is not a general available product. So this is not going to be a fully featured shippable product. This is going to be more of a proof of concept that demonstrates the ingredients on how to bake a pie. There's going to be bugs and design flaws within the code because there always is. However, the premise of this product is that it remains the same. The next thing is this is not going to cover best practices within microcoding. So we're not going to be looking at CQRS. We're not going to be looking at event sourcing. So CQRS, for those people who don't know what that is command query responsibility segregation. It's just the next thing we're going to be doing. The next thing we're not going to be doing is this is not an introduction to C# and PowerShell. So we're going to have we're just going to be assuming here that there's going to be a bit of an understanding of PowerShell and also a little bit of understanding of C#. It doesn't need much, but we just kind of, it just helps. The next thing is it's not going to be an introduction into Function App. I'm not going to be covering the ins and outs of all what triggers are and all these kinds of things. I'm just going to be focusing on the content again because I don't have enough time to go through into that depth. Finally, this is not going to be an introduction into those Azure technologies. So again, we're not going to be doing a deep dive into those products. What we're going to be doing is looking at the configuration aspects, but deep diving is not going to be happening in this talk. And finally, we're not going to be talking about Microsoft Authentication Library. So I'm not going to be talking about how it works. I'm just going to be, again, breezing through it. I'm going to talk about how I've implemented it, but there's not going to be a deep dive into that. Again, all slides are on GitHub. For those people who are interested, this was built, my on-prem environment was built with Automated Lab. PowerShell module. Also, this is a very shortened version of a summit talk. So I've got a 90-minute talk to squeeze into 45. So yes, I'm just looking at the clock as well. So let's talk about the challenge. So we've got 4 goals that we want to achieve here. The first goal is we want to build an IT self-service portal. The second one is we need to be able to leverage our on-premise products. So we need to still be able to touch our Exchange server if we have an on-prem Exchange server, the directory, those kinds of services. The third thing we need to do is it needs to be serverless. And what I mean by serverless is I mean static coding. So thinking, like GitHub pages, things like that. And finally, the solution needs to be scalable. So for an IT person who needs to add a new tile to the page, essentially, rather than actually hard coding into a portal, they can write that tile as a configuration item and then publish that to the portal. Cool. So let's talk about the solution. Oops, we jumped a couple of slides. So what we're going to be doing here is this is a very, very simple graphic. And we're going to follow the request, approval, and action approach. So we have our client up the top here. Our client is going to make a request, and it's going to be an authenticated request using Azure Active Directory to our function app. Our function app will then post that approval to Microsoft Teams, since our Teams, let's say, is our default collaboration source. And then from that, once approval has been given, we're going to leverage Azure Automation, hybrid runbook workers, to touch our on-premise products. So what we can do here is, this is just going to be a very simple layout. We're going to start to now go into a bit more of a deep dive. So let's keep going. So we're going to need 4 languages. We're going to need some PowerShell. PowerShell, obviously, it's a PowerShell conference. We're going to make PowerShell do all our heavy lifting. We're going to have some CSharp, CSharp for our durable functions. PowerShell does support durable functions. It's super, super pre-alpha. So we're going to use CSharp instead for our durable functions. We're going to have some JavaScript for our client, and again, some CSS and HTML for our client as well. Cool. So let's take a look at this process. So I've got a bit of a video demo, and we're going to have a bit of a squiz here. So first thing we're going to do is going to browse to our site. Again, we can see there you had the pop-up box. That pop-up box is our OAuth process. We've obtained a token. We've now got our configuration. You can see here we've got forgive my Azure name. It's terrible. We have some owners here, and we have some files. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump on our on-prem domain controller, because I need to grab a user. As you can see here, this is my domain controller. I've got a whole bunch of users. I'm just going to go ahead and grab the email address. We're going to go back to our portal. I'm going to pop that email address into our field, and then we're going to select a role group. So we're going to add this user to an on-prem Active Directory role group. So we're going to select the payroll role group, and then we're going to hit submit. And then we get a nice little toast up there saying request submitted. So once that's done, I'm just going to refresh Teams. In Teams, we get our IT self-service requests. So the first thing we can see there is we can see the user that's requesting the access, and we can see what the resource they're trying to access. This is the owner. So the owner can go yep or yeah, nah. So we're just going to say yeah. We're going to say yeah, nah, yeah, and we're going to approve that. And we're going to just give it a quick little comment. I'm going to say approved. Following that, that's now going to go and trigger our workflow. Now our workflow, which is our durable function, will go ahead and start our Azure Automation Hybrid Runbook. So if we go back to our Active Directory here, you're going to see here we're going to go ahead and refresh our users. I'm going to double click on Abby. If we go to a member of, you can see there, now she's been added to that role group. So it's pretty cool stuff. Like, it's pretty cool. So, yep. Yep. Okay. Is that better? Sorry. Is that better? Is everyone not hearing my breath? All right, we'll just, yeah. I did actually have RTX voice, except I didn't want to actually, I didn't want to use it right before the talk and then have something stuff out on me. So unfortunately, I'm not going to be using it for the time being. Anyway, keep going, adding features. So the first thing is what we said before, this product needs to be scalable. So one of the key features that we need to any IT self-service portal is to have the ability to add new features to the portal. So with this in mind, let's have a look at how we add configuration. So I'm just going to open up a new tile. First thing to notice here, you guys, is we have two tiles. So we're going to go ahead and add that third tile. So in here we have our PowerShell helper function. We're not going to go into the detail here. We're going to do that a little bit later. And we're going to go ahead and copy our schema. So I've just got a quick schema txt file. I'm going to quickly talk about that in a second. Once I go ahead and rename it and get my notes. So once we got, and what we're going to do is we're just going to create a PS1 file. So it's just a static PowerShell file. And you can see here, it's just a hash table. There's nothing special with it. And in this hash table, we have separate child hash tables declared to describe different aspects of our configuration. So the first thing we have here is our runbook parameters. The runbook parameters in this configuration item corresponds to our PowerShell, our Azure Automation runbook. So we're going to input our put our runbook name in, and then we're going to have our parameters. So as you can see here, I'm just going to go ahead. I'm having some typos. We're going to then put our parameters. Now the parameter name is the parameter name of our Azure Automation runbook, and the HTML name, we're going to talk about that in a second once we go a bit further in this demo, is the HTML element ID, ID, unique identifier for that specific value. So let's go ahead and paste. I'm just going to create a second entry because we have a username. And if we're adding a user to a distribution group, well, we're going to need to have a distribution group as well. So let's go ahead and add that as well. So I'm just going to fast forward here because I'm going to keep try and make up some time. And once we've done that, we're going to go down to the REST body property. So in our REST body property, we have the type. The type is used by the client to match the REST body response. I'm not going to talk about the technical details, but it's just used for matching. Then we have this HTML name selected. And this is a very cool attribute. This is what is added to that logic app or that Teams message that you saw. User wants to add this and wants to do this and add value. So that value that is going to be inputted from the portal will then get passed into this, and that will handle our approval. Cool. So what I'm going to do now is we're just going to go to our REST type body. We're just going to copy and paste our types. So you can see here, if we just go go a bit further. I'm just having a bit of a look. We're just going to fast forward a bit. So you can see here we now have the HTML content. So in the HTML content, we have the type we just quickly talked about. Then we have the response URL. So the response URL is the URL that we want to send the REST request to. Then we have the title of the card and the description. So you can see here, I'm just going to go ahead and fill them out to a distribution group. We're going to just copy and paste that into the distribution. And then after that, you see here we have the owners. So we can hard code some owners. Now, if we were to use role-based access, I would perform a lookup in 365 and go and fetch those corresponding owners. For example, if it's a distribution group, go get the owners of the distribution group. In this instance, just to keep things simpler, I'm just hard coded it. Now we're just going to add my owner. So again, this is an array, so you can have multiple owners on a resource. And then finally, here we have the HTML config. So the HTML config is used to describe what elements are needed for that tile. So essentially, we're just writing some HTML here, but we're not actually writing HTML. We're just describing what we are going to write, similar to what you would have in some sort of in DSC. So we're just going to, you see here we have the HTML name. So this is that matching HTML name I was talking about before. So it's just a unique identifier that matches this specific element to our runbook parameter. So we have two types of elements. It's a very sophisticated portal. It's only got two types. We have input and select. So input, obviously, for HTML input is just a generic text box, where a select is a drop-down. One little caveat with that is if the element type is an input, under the values, this will be a placeholder. So the render, the client will see it and say, hey, this is a sorry, my timer is just playing funny buggers. It will recognize that this is a client, this is an input, so we'll just create a placeholder. If it's a select, it'll dynamically build that drop-down box. So we're going to go ahead, create our values. So we're just going to add a username. And you can see here, we're then going to create a copy of this because we need to create a whole bunch of distribution groups, add a whole bunch of distribution groups, sorry. So again, we're going to give another HTML name. We're going to call this just distro group. We're going to call it select because it is going to be a select drop-down box. And then we're going to select our element type and we're going to make it a select. Following that, we're then going to give it some values. So I'm just going to add some values. I'm just going to fast forward here. You can see here, we just got some distribution groups to add. So once that's done, I'm just going to clean up my code a little bit. And I'm now going to grab these HTML names and add them to our runbook parameters. I'm also quickly going to stop by and add it to our authorization prompt as well. So we're just going to add that. Oops. And then once we've done that, we're then going to add it to our runbook parameters. So I don't know why I was doing that. But anyway, so if we scroll up, now you can see that we're now going to then perform. We're going to then associate that specific element to that specific parameter. Cool. All right. So now we can save it. In this instance, we have to deploy the function and restart our function app, but ultimately we can just host this on a blob storage or anything like that. We can go ahead and restart. So if we go ahead, restart, good to go. We can go ahead and restart our function app. We can get our OAuth, and there we go. There's our new card. How cool is that? You can see we've got our placeholder automatically inserted via the client, and then we can go ahead and add our specific user to a distribution group. And that is how we add our configuration. So yeah, all right, let's go on to the next slide. Cool. Let's now talk about the infrastructure. So I want to quickly touch base on the layout so everyone has a bit of an understanding of how everything kind of hangs together. It makes it a little bit easier to follow along. If I kind of just jumping from pieces of code to jumping from code to code, it kind of people are just going to get lost. So I'm going to hope this helps. The first thing we have is our client. So obviously our client is making a REST request. Now keep in mind, this is a web client. It doesn't need to be a web client. We can make it a Teams client. We can be Discord chat. It can be whatever it needs to be. It can be a phone app, whatever. At the end of the day though, this is an API that we're interacting with and we're using this API to do our render. We're having a client rendering from that configuration. So if we're now going to do an initial REST request to our Azure API management. So Azure API management is proxying all our traffic. We're using Azure API management's URLs. So there's no URLs. There's no internal URLs that are being used. It's all being proxied through Azure API management. Now, one little boo-boo I made with this graphic is that Azure API management also proxies any REST request that is any REST request between our endpoints. So as you can see here, we have our durable function, and our PowerShell helper off the side here is interacting with, is being interacted with using REST. So it will proxy that. But off to the side here, our PowerShell helper is going to help with our durable functions. Our durable function will be responsible for our workflow and our approval process. And then down the bottom here, we have our logic app. Now, logic app will is responsible for our team's authorization and notification. So that process will trigger, and obviously we have an approval response. Approval response will trigger an approval function, a HTTP function, which will then correspond and trigger an event to our durable function. Now, the key thing here is that when we're triggering this, this approval process, the durable function instance ID is what is needed to be able to raise the event. If you don't have that, you cannot raise this event. All right, cool. I'm just also looking at the time and I am definitely running behind. All right, so next thing I want to quickly talk about is our app registration. So for our client to be able to interact with Azure Active Directory, we need to register an app. So I'm going to go here. we're going to go to Azure Active Directory. I'm just going to show you the guys the configurations that's required. We're going to go app registrations. I have my automation task client. The first thing to notice and the important thing we need from this specific screen is our client ID. When we're using Microsoft Authentication Library, the only thing we need is our client ID to be able to authenticate. If we don't have that, we're obviously going to have issues, but at the same time, it's a requirement for it. Then once we have that, we're then going to go to our authentication. I've just got some redirect URIs configured. We're also going to have implicit grant turned on. So you can see here, I've got my implicit grant. And then finally down the bottom here, we also have multi-tenant turned on. These two are requirements for Microsoft Authentication Libraries, again. So you need to have these values set. Once we've done that, we're going to need to go ahead and create a scope. A scope is what gives us our app permissions. So here, what we're going to do is I'm going to expose an API, and I'm going to create a scope. So I'm just going to create my scope here. It's a very straightforward scope. I'm just going to call it app.read. And what we're going to do is with that app.read, we're then going to go to our API permissions and add it to our client. So using that, we can then be able to authenticate using app.read rather than Microsoft's graphs scope. Now, one of the things that a lot of gotchas that I did find with Microsoft Graph is you cannot validate a Microsoft Graph JSON web token. It's just not possible. It has a nonce on it, which basically prevents replay attacks. So we cannot validate our token. And that is essentially it for our client. That's how we configure our client app. So the next thing is our IAM function permissions. So our PowerShell helper is doing all this heavy lifting. So it's responsible for starting the hybrid runbook workers, all that kind of stuff. So it needs to have IAM permissions to be able to access Azure Automation. So what we need to do here is we're going to go to my helper, so my helper function app, and then we're going to go to platform features. I'm going to select identity, and we're going to enable this function app with an identity. Once we can do that, we can then go back to our resource group, and we can then go and add an IAM role. So once we can just go ahead, click and add a role assignment, and then under role, I'm just going to give it owner. Don't give it owner. And then we can actually select the function app. Once we select the function app, you can see our function there, and then we are good to go. And that is it. We don't need to do any sort of other we don't need to do any sort of REST or anything like that. Cool. So the next thing is I'll quickly want to talk about is Azure API management. So within Azure API management, I'm just going to quickly go through the configuration. When it decides to fast forward. Okay, cool. So the first thing we note here, as I said before, Azure API management is proxying all our URLs and out. So it's proxying our automation task. And so our automation task is our durable function. PS helper is our PowerShell helper, and Teams approval is our Microsoft Teams approval process, our logic app. So we're just going to quickly go through here. It's a fairly standard configuration. The only differences within the automation task is it has a cause policy set up. And we just have some cause policies set up here. So I was going to have a quick look at those. You can see in here we have just got some allowed origins. We're going to allow the get, post, and options. And then we're just going to expose some headers as well. The PowerShell helper and the Teams approval logic app don't have any cause headers. The reason why is because they're an internal query. They don't need it. The second thing is that they don't require authentication. What they use is subscription keys. So to protect against unauthorized access. So we're just going to use subscription keys to do that. Now, one really cool little thing is to create a subscription key. You can just go to subscriptions in the left side there, and then you can go ahead and create a subscription. It's really, really straightforward. I'm also just being aware of time. I've got 20 minutes left, and so another thing which is really important is I'm just going to quickly fast forward here. Is how to add a function app, so to APIM. So to do that, all you got to do is click on add a function app here. So I'm going to go ahead and go ahead and do that. And once we do that, you can see here I'm going to browse to my function app. I'm going to click my function app. I'm going to just use my hot copy user sentiment function app. Select what methods you want. Click select. It'll fill out a display name. and then you just click create, and then it'll automatically add it there for you, and you're good to go. And it's that easy. So that is how we configure Azure API management. Cool. So the function app. Let's quickly go back to my slides. Cool. All right. So before we can understand the function app, I wanted us to understand the client workflow, how the client is accessing those API endpoints. So as you can see here, what we're going to, this is crucial so that when we're reviewing the function apps, you guys can understand what URLs are being hit and why we're doing it, what we're doing, what I'm doing and why. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to obtain an access token using MSA help. Now note here we're interacting with Azure Active Directory. The function app hasn't been touched yet. After we have a successful OAuth process, it's going to respond with a bearer token. That bearer token then will be cached by a Microsoft Authentication Library. And now we're ready to query our initialize. The initialize endpoint, what this does is it requests the configuration that is needed to render those tiles on the screen. Hey, I need data, give me the data. Show me what you've got. So what will happen here is it'll trigger that. And then on top of that, it will also attach the bearer token. So this is an authenticated process. This is just not an anonymous function. This is requires an actual authentication. Once that process is successful, our function token will respond back with the configuration here. You can see here with our configuration, and it's in JSON. We're obviously going to never give you up. Never going to give you up. That configuration then is used by our client to render. So it's going to draw those nice tiles on the screen. It's all going to, that configuration is rendered using JavaScript, and it'll draw those nice tiles on the screen. And yeah, that's basically it for your website being loaded. And then when the client is ready to make a request, what happens is they will select the button, and then the internal JavaScript will then compile that into a REST request, and it will send it to this Invoke Request HTTP start endpoint. This will start our workflow, and this is the approval workflow. So, hey, I want to do this action. That is essentially the client process. So let's take a look at the initialize workflow. So this is the first part of that workflow that's getting touched. So we are going to have a look at code, but I need to kind of take you guys over I need to take you guys on a bit of an overview before we go into it, because you guys will get lost. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to hit our initialize. Again, it's just a get. The initial request is going to be posted with the header. The initialization is going to be triggered. Then we're going to have our token validation. So again, we're going to validate our bearer token, make sure it's legit. Once that is completed, we're going to get our configuration. Now, this gets a little bit funky here. This is just an internal thing that I've done. What happens is, if the function app, the durable function app's being run for the first time, it doesn't have the cache. And so what it's going to do is it's going to go to our PowerShell helper and request the cache, and request the configuration that is needed for the client to render. And so the PowerShell helper will go, yep, I can do that, and it'll hand back that JSON response. That response is returned to the client, and the durable function will also cache that for future use. So then we're not relying on this REST query here. So let's go ahead and take a look at some code. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to dive into some CSharp. We're going to have a look at the initialization, validation, and configuration, and then we're going to go and have a look at our helper. So let's go and do that. Cool. So you can see here we have a generic HTTP function, very stock standard, nothing super special here. The first thing you can see what's happening is we're validating our token. So if I'm just going to quickly have a quick squiz at that code, you can see in here that we're basically looking at we're getting our issuer, our audience, we're building our validation parameters, and then essentially down here, we're validating our token. It's pretty straightforward. The next thing is we're then going to get our configuration. So again, this is retrieving if it's not cached. it will then go and request. It will then request from our PowerShell helper. But if it is cached, it will just return the cached. It will return the cache value. So if it's not cached, obviously it's going to call our helper. And you can see here we're just doing a HTTP call saying, hey, go here, get me this. We need some content. We need our configuration. And it'll quite happily go and do that. And that's basically it for our initialize. It's really simple. So the next thing is we're going to now take a look at the helper file. So let's go and do that. So just for guys who are not familiar, the helper file, we're talking about this one here. So let's go take a look at that. So again, this is really, really simple. So what we have here is a basic PowerShell script. We're essentially just loading some resources in. We've got an assembling that we're adding. Once we've done that, we're basically .sourcing our path. You can see the path that we're .sourcing is this configurations directory, and we're .sourcing each of these PS1 files into that into this loop. And what we're going to do is we're going to pass it our custom class. This custom class is the configuration builder class. It's just the custom class that converts PowerShell hash tables into C# objects, which allows really just easy serialization, deserialization. So it's just a nice little helper. Once it's done that, it'll add it to an array, and then once we have all our configuration, it'll push it back to our initialize HTTP function, and that's it. It's very simple. So now let's go into a little bit more depth, and let's go have a quick talk about the invoke requests. So there's a fair bit more moving parts here. I'm going to have to kind of fly through this a little bit quicker because I'm looking at the clock, unless I can get an extension, which I probably can't, so that's totally fine. What we're going to do here is we can see the client is now going to submit it's going to submit a request. That request is going to be a post message. The body of the message is the request is going to be encoded in the body. Again, we're going to validate our tokens. We're then going to validate our configuration. This is again going to call our PowerShell helper. And what this does is it's looking at the client configuration that's published, and what it's doing is it's looking for any sort of anomalies. Is the configuration legit, or did the client mess with the configuration? So for instance, you've got a drop-down box and we have, a distribution group that it's trying to add to, yet some user gets super savvy and updates the configuration and changes it to domain admins. So things like that. It's looking for, it can validate it against its known good configuration, and then from that, it will then it can then perform its matching. If it's invalid, it will reject the request. Once the request is accepted, it will then request approval. Now, it will then post a request to our logic app with the instance ID of our durable workflow. Following that, it will then wait. So our durable function now stops, and it will wait for an approval event, which will be triggered from our logic app. So our logic app will trigger our approval event, which will then resume our workflow. Once that's all been completed, it will then prepare the runbook for execution. So it'll look at the runbook and say, okay, we'll look at the configuration and build out the necessary info to be able to start our automation runbook. And then again, we're going to call our PowerShell helper, and we're going to go and start our runbook. And so let's go and take a look at some of this code. So let's take a look at the C#. Again, I'm going to quickly fly through this because I know I've got about 10 minutes left. So in our initialize invoke request. So down the bottom here, you can see we're triggering that we have a durable function, HTTP function, which we're triggering. So again, we're validating our authentication. I'm basically deserializing the requests, and I'm tacking on some additional items like the claims principal, because we need to get the username that's submitting it. We can get that from our JSON token. Following that, we then go ahead and we're going to go and start right here our workflow. So within here, you can see our durable function's been started. We're going to go and attempt to deserialize. So we're just going to make sure everything's A-OK when we're deserializing our input. Following that, we're going to call our test configuration. So we're going to make sure our configuration is valid. So that's that PowerShell helper that we're calling. Following that, we're going to send a request to Microsoft Teams for approval. And then it's going to, you see here, we have an await. So we're going to wait for that, we're going to call our Teams approval. And then following that approval, we're then going to wait for our either of one of these two events to be raised. Once those events have been raised, if it's a successful, as you can see, it's response deny event, we're then going to go through and we're going to match up our configuration to our for our runbook and a configuration and a values from our configuration to our runbook. And then from that, we're going to again call our helper and start our runbook. And that's pretty much it. It's fairly very straightforward. So let's take a quick look at our configuration tester. So in here, you can see if we have a test configuration, we're going to be calling test configuration. So in here, this is quite a lengthy PowerShell script. I'm not going to go through it entirely. We're going, again, what I'm doing here, we're building our configuration from a known source. From that, we're basically going to be matching the types. So we're going to be matching our configuration types. We're going to be then validating the runbook parameters, making sure that they're valid and that they're correct. We're then going to validate our input. So we're going to make sure that any select statement that was added has the correct value. So if there's someone added domain admins and it wasn't in that drop-down box, it will then prevent that from happening. Once that's all done, it'll then return back a success. And that's pretty much that. So the next thing I'll quickly talk about is the client. I've got 8 minutes, so I'm going to try and spend 2 minutes talking about the client, which is probably not enough. So we'll see how we go. So the client is really, really basic. Oops, I forgot to, I'm going to reopen that. The client is really basic. So the first thing, notice, this is our website right here. So we literally have 43 lines of code. It's static, completely static, with the exception that we're calling, we're calling Materialize. So we're using Google's Materialize for all our animations and things like that. And we're calling Microsoft Authentication Library. So the first thing I want to quickly talk about is our configuration. So I talked about this before, which was our client ID. So we needed that client ID for Microsoft Authentication Library. So we pop that in there. We specify our cache. I'm going to just specify our endpoint. So this is just a quick little object. And then once the document's been loaded, we're going to prompt for so we're going to create a object for our user application. I'm going to register a callback. We're going to register this function, which is responsible for our initialize call. So our client initialize that we're calling, this is what will trigger it. And then we're going to have our callback. So once that's completed, we're going to then call this method, which is the login pop-up. So using that request object, which was that request object that we talked about up here, our scopes, sorry, we need to actually define our scopes. Once we've done that, we can go ahead and then request our login. At this point in time, this is the thing I love about Microsoft Authentication Library. It handles the rest. So it does all the OAuth process. And then the only thing we need to do is in this response, that's where the OAuth bearer token will be stored. So from that, we can then just go, we can call acquire token initialize, which will call this function here, which will in turn call out acquire token invoke rest method. It's essentially just invoke rest method, but it's just a wrapper for it. And then in here, we have a callback that we've registered. And so this callback function, once that process has been successful, will return the deserialized JSON object, that configuration that we've just got from the server, and it's going to say, hey, go render it. And that's pretty much it. I'm not going to take you through the render configuration. The only thing that's really worth mentioning here is within the render configuration, actually, no, we're not going to go through it because I'm just trying to be courteous of time here. Once that's completed, the next thing that we have to do is we have to submit a request. So user needs to submit a request. So again, we're going to create a REST body. We're then going to start matching that data to and the parameters that's required for that REST body response, and then dynamically building that REST body response. Once we've done that, we can go ahead, acquire our token, and then send our response. And you can see here, it's going to send it to our response URL. and that's our client. Obviously, we have some other things here. So we've got render configuration and all this kind of jazz, and there's a bit of JavaScript that handles the look nice and feel nice, look good, feel nice GUI. But in terms of simplicity, it's that simple. So the final thing I quickly want to talk to you about is the approval process. The approval process is a logic app. It is super basic. So I'm not using any sort of custom app service or anything like that. I literally just went, well, we can just create a logic app and we can do it through that. Super easy. So in logic app, what we can do here is let's just go have a quick look at that demo. So you can see here, again, it's a REST endpoint. I've just got some, I've got a schema set, and literally we're going to scroll down. You can see here, we've got a card, post a choice of options as the flowbot to the user. We've got our owner, we've got our message. Following that, we're then going to compose our response here. So you can see we have the instance ID will be the durable function instance ID, and then the selected option, whether it's approved or denied. After that, send it back to our response. So that is literally it. It's that simple. So super easy, super yeah, super cool. After that, I'm just quickly going through, and now we have the PowerShell helper. So let's take a quick look at the PowerShell helper now. So in here, if we quickly have the start runbook, we have our PowerShell helper. So again, it's a generic HTTP function, nothing special. We're just passing through that, passing through our body. We're building our parameters. I'm going to perform a lookup on the runbook. I'm not going to just blindly execute a runbook. So it's going to make sure that the runbook exists. It's then going to construct the runbook parameters. Now, there's a little gotcha here where if you have a nested hash table within a function app, for some reason, it doesn't convert the, within PowerShell, it doesn't convert the nested hash table to be case insensitive. And so what happens is, I was having this issue where I was trying to start the runbook and it wasn't working, and I couldn't work out why. And it was because there was this bug with it. So yeah, it's a little gotcha there that I found quite interesting. And kudos to Mark for that. He was the one that really dug that one out. After that, we're just going to splat it in because splatting's awesome. And then we just start our runbook. And because we have those IAM permissions configured, we don't need to deal with any of that. And that's pretty much it, stock standard. So let's quickly just go through what we did. So we briefly went through the process of setting up our infrastructure. So looking at our Azure Functions permissions, our APIM permissions, all those kinds of things. We took a review of the layout. We had a look at the architecture. We had a bit of a look at the function apps, bit of the code underneath. We had a look at the code of the client and using Microsoft Authentication Library. And then finally, we just had a quick look at our PowerShell helper. So yeah, that's pretty much it. With 1 minute and 45 seconds, does anybody have questions? I would expect there's going to be a lot of questions. I'm just going to quickly go to that site. I might run out of time in the meantime. Let's just quickly see if we can get to that site in time. If anybody has any questions. Private window. Okay, let's see if we have questions. I've got 1 minute to answer some questions. What's the cost differences between durable functions and normal Azure functions? Okay, Azure functions have a 10-minute runtime. So the important with durable functions is that you have that expanded runtime. You don't pay for any usage on a durable function while the durable function is not running. But in terms of costings, they're pretty much the same. Do you have the code of your various functions, mainly the durable one, available? Yes. If you go and have a look at my GitHub, I'll just quickly, if you go to my GitHub, I'll post a link in below. You'll be able to grab the entire project, all the demos, all the source code. Seeing that durable functions is not supported with PowerShell yet, what durable function would you give? What would durable function give you compared to run ID and store the info externally? So yeah, it'll be the instance ID. that's what you'll be using. How long does this take you? Well, ultimately, this was a project that actually was done over Christmas. It took me about 2 months, pretty much every weekend to build. But the thing was is that I was learning a lot of the lessons that you guys don't need to learn. So, and with that, the countdown is at 0. And I bid adios, farewell, ciao.